Aerys II Targaryen had once imagined himself as the greatest king ever to grace the Iron Throne, a second coming of Aegon the Conqueror in his own mind's eye, but his lustrous dreams had withered in the dark corridors of his own paranoia. Many called him the Mad King, though most never dared to speak the words where prying ears might overhear. He knew they whispered about him in the Red Keep. He felt their stares, always skittering across his back. The realm was fractious and unsettled, and though he was not yet ancient, the passage of time and the burdens of the crown had worn him down more than he ever anticipated. That night, as an autumn storm rattled the windows of his chambers, Aerys convened his small council in a manner more subdued than usual. There had been no bellowing or half-deranged laughter. He was calm in a way that set them all on edge, for the Mad King's calm could be more frightening than his rages. The feeble glow of the candles made his sunken eyes appear as hollows of swirling darkness. Outside, thunder cracked like the voice of vengeful gods. The lords and advisors who answered his summons stood behind the massive oak table, each uncertain of what would be demanded of them. Varys was there, blending into the shadows in his voluminous robes. Grand Maester Pycelle rubbed his hands together and fussed with his chain of office. Lord Carlton Chelsted, the Master of Coin, and other less notable courtiers hovered at the edges. Only the king's hand was missing. Tywin Lannister had resigned in bitterness years before, and Aerys had never replaced him with a man of equal competence. In truth, none had dared to assume the role fully, for the threat of the king's displeasure was ever looming. The assembled men braced for the kind of outburst that had become all too common of late. But tonight, Aerys only closed his eyes and spoke a single measured command. "Bring me the crown of the realm." It was not the first time the king had asked to gaze upon the symbol of his power. Sometimes he would wear it through the night, muttering of destiny and grand conspiracies. Sometimes he burned his fingers on the metal's edges in fits of trembling. Yet there was something in his tone that made even the candles waver, as if the flames themselves sensed a turning point. When at last the gilded crown was delivered to him in a satin-lined chest, Aerys raised it with skeletal hands. He was uncommonly silent. Then he placed the crown carefully in front of him on the table, as though it were a fragile piece of glass rather than solid gold. His hair, grown long and white as bleached bone, framed his gaunt cheeks. The wind howled outside, and the flicker of lightning lit him in sharp relief. Everyone waited. "I have worn this burden too long," he said in a voice that scarcely reached above a whisper. "Varys, you have been collecting whispers in the wind, have you not? Has the realm not turned against me, even as I cling to this metal band?" His question was rhetorical, but he fixed his attention on the master of whisperers nonetheless. Varys bowed with elaborate courtesy, the sleeves of his robe pooling around his feet. "Your Grace, my birds sing many things. Some of those songs may be disloyal, but you are the king, and none may stand against the will of the dragons, so long as—" "Do not patronize me, spider," Aerys snapped, though still quietly. "I have heard the traitorous talk. I know Robert Baratheon sits in the Stormlands, forging alliances. I know the Starks grow restless in the north. Even my own son Rhaegar, he has grown to manhood beneath my shadow, and I have not always treated him well." Aerys's eyes became distant, as if remembering all the times his son had chafed under his rule. All the fatherly moments that never were. All the illusions. "I am not so mad," Aerys said with a quiver in his voice, "to believe that I can hold the 7 kingdoms by fear alone. Fire can burn our enemies, or it can burn us from within." There was a deep silence. Then the king inhaled as though he were drowning, his chest shuddering. His hand reached out to caress the crown. "I have decided," he said, and those 3 words felt heavier than the crown itself. "I will abdicate. Let the realm see a new Targaryen upon the throne. A prince who has not yet lost his mind to the shadows." The men in the room almost collapsed under the weight of the statement. Grand Maester Pycelle's jaw fell open and he blurted, "Your Grace, this is most unexpected. Are you certain?" "Question not my will," Aerys hissed. Then, in a swift pivot to gentleness, He turned his gaze to the crown once more. I should have done this years ago. Rhaegar is the realm's beloved son. He is a warrior, a poet, a man who understands that rule is a double-edged sword. He will do better than I. My time is over. I have seen it in the flames. Those last words carried the tinge of the mania that so often plagued him. Yet his purpose was clear enough. That very night, ravens were dispatched in secrecy across the realm, carrying the king's startling proclamation. Aerys II Targaryen would step down from the Iron Throne, naming his son, Crown Prince Rhaegar, as King Rhaegar I Targaryen. The eyes of the lords and ladies who read the parchment widened. Whispers spread in halls, in taverns, in back-alley gatherings. Some believed it was a ploy, a cunning trap to lure traitors into the open. Others dared to hope that the new king might bring an era of stability and peace. Few recalled a Targaryen abdication in living memory, and none could predict how the realm would shift in the coming weeks. In the Red Keep, Rhaegar himself was roused from his bed in the early hours to attend his father. The crown prince arrived at the royal apartments clad only in a loose robe, his silver-gold hair falling around his shoulders in tangles. He found his father alone, gazing at the crown as if at a distant star. Aerys looked up when Rhaegar appeared. For a moment, the father's face was devoid of malice or anger, only a weariness that tugged at Rhaegar's heart. "You will be king," Aerys said simply. "Tomorrow, I will make the announcement in the throne room before the court. Will you accept this duty, my son?" Rhaegar swallowed. He knew there was no real choice in the matter. Destiny had always pointed him toward kingship, though he had never expected it to come in this fashion. "Yes, father," he murmured, bending the knee in front of the older man. The moment was surreal, for he had never knelt to his father in private. Aerys too was not known for paternal warmth. Yet, in that flickering candlelight, Rhaegar found himself pitying the broken creature before him. "Good," Aerys whispered, placing a shaky hand on Rhaegar's shoulder. "Then let the realm rejoice or tremble. The crown passes from me to you at sunrise." And so it was. The next day, the great throne room was packed with lords, knights, and courtiers of all ranks, all drawn by rumor or summoned by command. Some half expected to see the old king in one of his wild fits, brandishing wildfire or roaring for them all to kneel. Instead, they watched him walk unsteadily onto the dais, clad in the regal black and red of House Targaryen. His manner was subdued, but the tension clung to the air. Beside him stood Rhaegar, tall and dignified, though a faint uncertainty shadowed his violet eyes. The hush was deafening. Aerys's voice carried across the hall. "You have called me mad. Perhaps I am. Yet I am not blind. My beloved son shall reign in my stead, for the good of the 7 kingdoms." He paused, coughed, and cleared his throat. "Hear me now. I, Aerys of House Targaryen, the second of my name, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 kingdoms, do hereby abdicate. Rhaegar Targaryen is your king." And he turned to Rhaegar. With trembling hands, he lifted the golden crown from his own head, musk silver hair tumbling out beneath it, and placed it carefully atop Rhaegar's. It was done. Silence reigned in the throne room for what felt like an eternity. Then the assembled men and women knelt, some uncertainly, many with genuine awe, others with cunning calculation. The name Rhaegar echoed through the vaulted space as they hailed their new monarch. Rhaegar, for his part, closed his eyes and felt the crushing weight of the crown settle on him. This was not a triumphant moment he had long dreamed of. It was a heavy, trembling passage from father to son, laden with the unspoken knowledge of Aerys' failings and the realm's precarious state. By evening, the matter of the king's new household was arranged. Certain men were replaced. The small council was restructured. Rhaegar requested that his father retire to a private suite in Rhaegar's holdfast, guarded but comfortable. The old king no longer had the final say, but Rhaegar treated him with some measure of respect and pity, ordering that his father be cared for by loyal attendants and that all humiliations be avoided. Aerys did not protest, sinking into his isolation with occasional fits of cackling, occasional moments of clarity. In those initial days, the realm held its breath. Word spread like wildfire. Aerys was out, Rhaegar was in. Many who had chafed under the Mad King's rule dared to dream that the Targaryen name might now be redeemed. Others muttered that the real trouble would begin once the old king's final wits deserted him entirely. And in the Stormlands, Robert Baratheon, young and full of restless energy, digested the news with measured silence. His friend, Eddard Stark of Winterfell, was visiting the Vale to see Jon Arryn. Word reached them by Raven, and they, too, wondered how this shocking turn of events might alter the future. But it was not only the lords of the realm who pondered the significance of a new Targaryen king. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell sat in the water gardens, reading the message under the filtered sunlight. The hush of the desert wind and the babbling of water around him were all that broke the stillness. Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, was his beloved sister. If Rhaegar was king, then Elia was queen, and their children, young Aegon and Rhaenys, were heirs. A faint smile curved Prince Doran's lips. Fate had shifted. Perhaps House Martell's star would rise higher than ever before. Doran had hopes that a realm under Rhaegar might be kinder to Dorne, might treat its people with a respect that had sometimes been lacking. Rhaegar's coronation took place on the 7th day after Aerys' abdication. Held in the Great September of Baelor, it was a spectacle of pageantry. The High Septon anointed him with the 7 oils, and Rhaegar knelt in his gleaming armor, silver hair cascading down his back, face solemn and composed. Queen Elia stood nearby, clad in rich purple, her dark eyes shining with both pride and an undercurrent of concern. The realm's greatest lords, even some who had reason to despise the old king, traveled to King's Landing to witness this event. Some came out of curiosity, others because the potential wrath of a Targaryen scorned was never far from mind. Robert Baratheon arrived, albeit reluctantly. He stood in the back with Eddard Stark, neither man quite certain how to regard this new era. Robert had once called Rhaegar a pampered princeling, but he had never hidden his admiration for Rhaegar's prowess in arms. Likewise, Eddard remembered how Rhaegar had once displayed a quiet dignity in the few times they had crossed paths, most memorably at the Harrenhal tourney. But underlying that memory was the bitter recollection that Rhaegar had crowned Lyanna Stark as the queen of love and beauty, passing over his own wife, Elia. Eddard tried to gauge Robert's feelings and glimpsed a flicker of jealousy or anger in the Baratheon's storm-blue eyes. Yet if Rhaegar was now king, would that old slight still fester, or could new alliances be forged? When the High Septon placed the crown upon Rhaegar's head, a swell of voices rose in unison. "Long live the king! Long live King Rhaegar!" The final note echoed off the pillars of the sept, and in that instant, it was as if the realm shared a single collective heartbeat. Some hearts beat with hope, others with wariness. Rhaegar dedicated his first official decree to a call for unity. Standing on the steps of the Great September after the coronation, he declared that the 7 kingdoms had suffered too many divisions in the past. "We must mend what has been broken," he said in a ringing voice. "We must restore faith between the crown and the great lords of Westeros. The Targaryen name was once a beacon of unity, not oppression. That is what I aspire to restore." He then announced a royal pardoning of certain minor lords who had run afoul of Aerys' harsh decrees. He invited ambassadors of each region to come forward and speak of their needs, their grievances. It was a small gesture, but symbolic, and many found themselves impressed by the king's willingness to listen. The populace of King's Landing, always fickle, began to murmur that perhaps this young king would be far different from the father they had grown to fear. Still, not everyone was so easily convinced. The seeds of rebellion had been planted too deeply for them to wither overnight. Robert Baratheon, after the coronation feast, found himself half-drunk and pacing in the courtyard. Eddard tried to calm him, but the Stormlord's emotions were aflame. "He took Lyanna from me?" Robert muttered, voice low but brimming with resentment. "At Harrenhal, he put that damnable crown of winter roses upon her head. I cannot forget the look on her face. She looked enthralled. And now that man sits the Iron Throne." He spat on the ground, ignoring the few courtiers who noticed. "One gesture of courtesy cannot mend 1,000 cuts." Eddard sighed. He never actually took her, Robert. You speak as though. He drew her in. He's responsible for making her dream of something else, something I couldn't give her. Robert's eyes were dark as a storm-tossed sea. I'll never forgive him for that. Ned had no easy reply. He did not wish to see House Stark embroiled in conflict, not when the future was so uncertain. Aerys, in the old timeline of Ned's mind, had been the cause of 1,000 ills. Now, with Rhaegar ascending unexpectedly, everything felt twisted out of the shape Ned had anticipated. There was no direct cause for open rebellion, no monstrous slight that demanded immediate vengeance. At least, not for House Stark. Brandon Stark had died under suspicious circumstances in the original timeline of horror Ned had once feared, but in this changed present, Brandon still lived. He was married now, albeit not happily, and had been absent from King's Landing for over a year. Without that direct wound, Ned found his anger cooled and replaced by apprehension. So many things were shifting. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep, King Rhaegar wasted little time reorienting the court. He appointed men he trusted to key positions. Lord John Connington became Hand of the King, a role Rhaegar believed his friend could fulfill with diligence and valor. Ser Barristan Selmy rose to command the Kingsguard now that the Lord Commander Gerald Hightower was aging and had expressed a wish to step down. The rest of the Kingsguard remained in place. Ser Arthur Dane, Ser Oswell Went, Ser Lewin Martell, and others known for their dedication. Rhaegar commanded them with the quiet authority he had always possessed, but now there was a finality to it. They bowed, and he saw in their eyes a reflection of the trust he hoped to earn or reaffirm. Elia Martell was crowned queen, and she bore the new station with grace. Her health had been delicate after the birth of her children, but there was a renewed glow to her features as she moved through the royal court, greeting lords and ladies who came to pay homage. Yet behind her composure lay a thin edge of tension. She knew too well that some might question her place, given the rumors of Rhaegar's affection for Lyanna Stark. That crown of winter roses had cast a long shadow. But if Rhaegar's devotion to Elia seemed steadfast, most would hold their tongues, for none would lightly cross the new king in his first days. And indeed, publicly, Rhaegar showed his wife respect and affection, never letting any slight tarnish her. If the old rumors still whispered in the corners, they found little purchase under the king's watchful gaze. Despite these outward signs of stability, the realm was a boiling pot on the verge of spilling. Lord Tywin Lannister, once Hand of the King under Aerys, had retreated to Casterly Rock years ago with a deep grievance. Many wondered how the new king would address the Lannisters, for Tywin was not a man to stay out of the game forever. And the Tyrells, stalwart in their ambition, watched closely. Highgarden's support would be crucial for any budding king. The Martells were obviously in favor of Rhaegar, tied by marriage, but the loyalty of the other great houses was less certain. The Greyjoys were hardly mentionable, for they remained aloof on their iron islands, giving lip service to whomever wore the crown. The Aarons had little reason to rebel, though if Robert Baratheon's bitterness remained, he might sway his foster father, Jon Arryn, to hostility. And the Starks of the North, they were proud, protective of their own, and rumored to harbor a quiet fury toward the Targaryens, though that had softened with Aerys' abdication. Rhaegar needed them all, or at least most of them, to keep the realm from fracture. So Rhaegar sent out invitations to each major house, requesting that their lords attend a grand council in King's Landing, a show of unity beneath his new reign. Many came or sent envoys, some with genuine hopes for peace, others to gauge the new king's strength. Robert Baratheon, however, declined to attend. He wrote a short, curt reply citing pressing duties in the Stormlands. That, in itself, was a statement. The new king did not publicly rebuke him, though murmurs in court described it as a thinly veiled insult. Ned Stark did attend, representing his father, Rhaegar Stark, who was in ill health. The sight of the young Lord Stark in the Red Keep's corridors drew more than a few curious looks. It was no secret that Ned had been close to Robert Baratheon for years. Would he be Rhaegar's foe or friend? The Grand Council convened in the throne room, though the Iron Throne itself loomed behind the dais. Rhaegar chose to stand before it rather than seat himself, in a gesture of humility or perhaps caution. The hundreds of lords and envoys arrayed before him resembled a field of living heraldry. Banners of roses, lions, falcons, wolves, and more. The king's voice rang out as he spoke of forging a new era, one in which old feuds could be set aside for the greater peace of Westeros. He spoke of justice, of laws that should apply to both peasant and lord. He assured them that the horrors of his father's rule had ended, that the monarchy would not stand above every principle of decency. His words were elegant and measured. Ser Barristan stood at his side, a silent testament to the king's sincerity. Some were impressed, others were skeptical. Ned Stark, listening quietly, found himself wishing to believe that the new king's dream for unity was real. If so, that dream could save untold lives. Yet he knew Robert would remain unconvinced. Lord Tyrell made polite utterances. The seat of House Lannister was conspicuously empty. Tywin had sent a cousin in his stead, which told volumes about his stance. Nonetheless, no one openly defied the king. For a time, a fragile calm seemed to descend upon the realm. Rhaegar's attempts to mend relationships began to yield modest results. Trade reopened more freely along certain roads. The small folk of King's Landing noted that the new king visited them in disguise from time to time, gleaning an understanding of their hardships. He ordered bread distributed to the poorest districts when the harvest fell short, a gesture that endeared him to the city's inhabitants. Even those who had dreaded the Targaryen name under Aerys found themselves softening. After all, Rhaegar was not his father. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment still brewed. Robert Baratheon had never been a man content with half measures. The memory of Harrenhal, of Lyanna's uncertain feelings, gnawed at him like a vulture picking at carrion. While Rhaegar sought alliances and respect, Robert found ways to sow discord. He hosted feasts in Storm's End, to which he invited smaller lords with grudges against the Targaryens, men who had lost family to Aerys' cruelty. Unofficial gatherings, quiet talk of the once and future rebellion, as some jokingly called it. At times, Eddard Stark's name would arise. Would House Stark ever stand for open conflict? None could say for certain. Lyanna Stark herself was in Winterfell. Her father, Lord Rhaegar, kept her close after rumors of her infatuation with Rhaegar had spread. She was a wild, spirited woman who detested the North's attempts to confine her. But she was also prideful and refused to speak at length about her thoughts on the new king. Some days, the spark in her eyes seemed to fade, replaced by a subdued resignation. On others, she rode her horse across the moors as if fleeing something intangible. Her betrothal to Robert Baratheon had not been formally broken, but neither had a wedding date been set. The entire matter hung in awkward limbo. Months passed. The realm did not erupt in flames, as many had feared, nor did it find the unblemished harmony Rhaegar sought. Instead, it drifted, with pockets of tension flaring in certain regions. There were rumors of bandit attacks near the Dornish marches, rumored to be financed by disgruntled stormlords. The new king, in response, dispatched men to keep the peace, to protect travelers and small folk. He personally traveled to Sunspear for several weeks, forging closer ties with the Martells. That visit was marked by feasts and quiet negotiations. Prince Doran Martell was cautious but sympathetic, seeing in Rhaegar the best hope for Dornish interests in decades. Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, took a more measured approach. He admired Rhaegar's skill with a blade but waited to see if the king's compassion was a mask or genuine. A measure of trust grew, though, and the bond between House Martell and the crown solidified. When Rhaegar returned to King's Landing, the city erupted in celebration. The king was greeted like a triumphant hero, perhaps because the memory of Aerys' gloom still lingered, making any lighter presence shine that much brighter. He received petitions in open court, listened to the concerns of merchants and fishermen, and even commanded that repairs be made to the crumbling walls around Flea Bottom. The Master of Coin complained, but Rhaegar insisted that the safety of the people was paramount. Taxes would be adjusted to fund the repairs. It was a bold move and not universally popular with the wealthier classes. One evening, in the privacy of his solar, Rhaegar dismissed all but a few of his closest confidants. Elia was there, as was Jon Connington, Ser Barristan, and Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard. They reviewed the letters that had arrived by Raven. One was from Tywin Lannister, who at last deigned to write directly to the king. In carefully couched phrases, Tywin expressed guarded support for the new reign but did not commit to any tangible alliance. Another letter bore the seal of House Baratheon, yet the script was not Robert's. It was from Stannis Baratheon, a more formal entreaty about shipping lanes around Dragonstone. Rhaegar considered it carefully, aware that Robert himself had refused to write. He recalled how Robert had scowled at the coronation, and how, in some ways, the big man was all too easily swayed by pride. Stannis, in contrast, was no friend to the Targaryens, but he was a practical man who might be more open to negotiation. "These letters," Rhaegar said, tapping them on the table, "speak of a realm not at war, yet not at peace. We are balancing on a knife's edge. If I press too hard to unify, I may become what my father was, an oppressor. If I press too lightly, I may allow rebellion to fester." Elia touched his hand gently. "You are not your father, my love. You will find a way, and you will not do it alone." Jon Connington, the hand of the king, nodded firmly. "We must ensure no single house feels favored above the others, aside from Dorne, of course." He added with a slight smile toward Prince Lewin. "But that is natural with the Queen's ties. Apart from that, if we can keep the Tyrells and Lannisters from joining forces with Baratheon, we might avoid open conflict." Prince Lewin Martell, leaning back in his white cloak, added softly, "The North is key. If the Starks remain neutral or loyal, Robert Baratheon loses much of his influence." Rhaegar looked at the flicker of candlelight on the table. "Then I must speak with Ned Stark again." He was reserved at the council, but not hostile. If the North stands with the crown, that might be enough to deter Robert from any rash actions. He paused, searching his wife's face. Elia offered him an encouraging smile. "Very well," he said. "We shall invite Ned Stark to court or travel north ourselves, perhaps in the spring." Another month drifted past. The name Rhaegar I Targaryen became more commonplace in the songs of wandering minstrels. Some even revived the ballads of Prince Rhaegar's harp, praising him as a warrior king who could play music that made the maidens weep. Though the realm's troubles were far from resolved, there was an undercurrent of cautious optimism, except in the Stormlands. Rumors persisted that Robert Baratheon was training troops, forging new weapons, and strengthening the defenses of Storm's End. When questioned, Robert's men claimed it was only prudent, given the bandits on the Dornish marches. Yet those rumors carried a faint smell of gunpowder waiting for a spark. That spark, as fate would have it, arrived from an unexpected quarter. Deep in the mountains of the Vale, a band of outlaws committed an atrocity, ambushing and slaughtering a small party of travelers. Among those killed was a cousin of Jon Arryn's, and suspicion quickly fell on the Stormlands. Some claimed that Robert had sanctioned the outlaws to sow chaos. Others insisted that these were merely brigands with no ties to House Baratheon. The tension rose swiftly, with Jon Arryn demanding an inquiry and Robert refusing to acknowledge any guilt. Rhaegar saw this as a chance to demonstrate his commitment to justice. He summoned Robert and Jon Arryn both to King's Landing to investigate the matter under the Crown's authority. Jon Arryn came, albeit with reservations. Robert did not. Instead, he sent a letter brimming with outrage, accusing the Crown of meddling in the affairs of the Stormlands. Rhaegar's eyes darkened as he read it. Jon Connington fumed, but the king insisted on restraint. The inquiry proceeded without Robert, concluding that the outlaws were not officially connected to House Baratheon. Even so, the entire incident stoked the embers of mistrust. A day after the inquiry concluded, Eddard Stark arrived in King's Landing, summoned by Rhaegar's personal request. Though the roads were clogged with mud and the winter chill was creeping in, Ned had made the journey. He was shown into the solar where the king awaited him, alone. Rhaegar dismissed the guards, wishing to speak plainly. The new king's silver hair caught the light from the window, making him appear almost ethereal. "Ned Stark," Rhaegar greeted him, motioning for him to sit. "I wish to speak with you as one man to another, not simply as king to vassal." Ned bowed, though it was a stiff gesture. "Your Grace." He took the offered seat. Rhaegar studied him. "I have heard the North is patient and proud, but also honorable. My father wronged your house in many ways. I cannot change that past, but I hope to ensure a future where House Stark and House Targaryen do not stand in enmity." Ned's face was unreadable at first, but he answered with quiet honesty. "My father has spoken of the injustices done under King Aerys. We recall well the fates of some of our kin. But we do see that your reign is different." He paused, glancing at his hands. "Yet there is a complication." "Robert Baratheon," Rhaegar said without missing a beat. "Your friend." A shadow flickered over Ned's face. "He was once like a brother to me. We grew up together in the Vale, under Jon Arryn's guardianship. He has grown bitter. He believes you wronged him by capturing Lyanna's affections. She is a wild wolf, my sister, but Robert sees only the pride of a spurned suitor. That anger consumes him." Rhaegar sighed. "I never intended to bring strife to Lyanna. Perhaps I was foolish at Harrenhal, making that gesture with the winter roses. I meant it as a tribute to her spirit, but it led to misunderstanding and pain. I have tried to repair that breach, but Robert will not heed my words. The realm stands in peril of fracturing from that single grievance." Ned nodded. "I have tried to counsel him toward peace. My father has spoken similarly. But Robert, he holds grudges in his heart like wildfire. I do not know if any words will make him yield." Leaning forward, Rhaegar said, "Then perhaps we need a more concrete bond, a marriage alliance of some sort. If Robert will not marry Lyanna, perhaps we can negotiate some other arrangement that ties House Baratheon to the crown." He paused, considering. "But that is your family's concern. I shall not propose something that offends House Stark." "Lyanna was betrothed to Robert," Ned said slowly. "That remains the official arrangement, unless my father breaks it or Robert does." Rhaegar felt a familiar pang. The memory of Lyanna's face, crowned in roses, haunted him still. But he tried to focus on the realm's best interests. "If we cannot rely on Robert's goodwill, then we must at least isolate him. If the North stands with the crown, that alone might stay his hand. He cannot hope to rebel without significant support, and if House Stark refuses to join him," Ned exhaled, as though weighed down by a moral burden. "House Stark has no intention of betraying the crown, not if the crown shows us fairness. We have not forgotten that you are a father and a husband, a man who has made overtures of peace. My father is old, but he is not blind to reason. He will not sanction open war against a just king." Ned paused. "But Robert might still find allies elsewhere." Rhaegar rose and walked toward the window, where the city sprawled beneath a slate-gray sky. "Then I must continue to earn the trust of the lords, so Robert's cause finds no fertile ground." Turning back, he smiled slightly. "I thank you for your candor, Lord Stark." The conversation ended with a promise that the crown would treat the North with renewed respect, curbing Aerys' old taxes that had fallen disproportionately on certain northern trade routes. Ned returned to Winterfell with guarded optimism. Perhaps, he thought, there was a path to avoid widespread bloodshed. Yet fate weaves its threads in unpredictable patterns. That winter, disease swept through parts of the North. Lord Rhaegar Stark fell gravely ill, and Ned was forced to assume many of his duties. Brandon Stark, the eldest son, was off traveling the Riverlands in search of new alliances for himself. Lyanna chafed at her father's illness and the sense of being trapped in Winterfell. She wrote letters to friends outside, though no one knew precisely who. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon seized the moment. He wrote to Brandon Stark, hinting that if the betrothal to Lyanna were formalized soon, it could unify their two houses and present a united front that could stand up to Targaryen intimidation. Brandon, being more hot-headed, saw some merit in the notion, though he rarely thought matters through carefully. In the midst of all these tensions, King Rhaegar held a lavish celebration in King's Landing for the name day of his son, Prince Aegon. Envoys from every corner of the realm arrived, bearing gifts and well wishes. The boy was only a toddler, clinging to his mother's skirts, but the festivities were grand. The king performed on his harp for the court, a sweet, melancholy melody that brought tears to many eyes. Queen Elia watched him with admiration, though there was a trace of sadness in her gaze. She knew how heavily the crown weighed on her husband's brow. It was at that celebration that news arrived from Storm's End. Robert Baratheon had publicly declared that the crown was too weak to secure the realm, citing the continued bandit raids and the crown's pampering of the Dornish. He claimed that King Rhaegar was turning a blind eye to the old feuds and was instead favoring Dorne above all. It was propaganda, carefully crafted to inflame long-standing resentments. Lords who had lost kin in the Dornish marches might be swayed by Robert's words. When the king's counselors read the parchment containing Robert's statement, outrage erupted. Jon Connington wanted Robert arrested for treason. Elia shook her head, urging caution, but the tension was undeniable. Rhaegar wrestled with the dilemma. If he did nothing, Robert's sedition might grow. If he used force, he risked becoming the tyrant his father had been. In the end, he sent a royal command for Robert to appear in King's Landing and answer for his words. He allowed the man one final chance to explain or recant. Robert refused to come. Instead, he declared he would only meet the king on neutral ground. That was the moment many recognized as the threshold of war. Voices in the Red Keep began clamoring for a preemptive strike against the Stormlands before Robert could rally an army. Jon Connington pressed Rhaegar to take Storm's End and bring Robert to heel. The king, torn, sought advice from his Kingsguard. Ser Barristan, wise and honorable, advised trying once more for peace. Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, remained silent, though his demeanor suggested caution. Prince Lewin Martell, while loyal to Rhaegar, saw the potential advantage for Dorne if Robert were crushed. It was a swirl of conflicting counsel, and Rhaegar felt the weight of 1,000 swords on his shoulders. At last, Rhaegar decided to travel to Storm's End himself, with a modest retinue that would include Jon Connington, Ser Barristan, and Ser Arthur Dayne. He would request parley with Robert, man to man. A risky move, but if it averted a war, it would be worth the danger. Queen Elia was anxious, but he reassured her. She had to remain in King's Landing, for her presence maintained stability in the court. The king's party set out just as winter's chill began to recede. They rode under the Targaryen banner, but with fewer than 100 men, trying to avoid the appearance of aggression. The journey was tense. When they crossed into the Stormlands, the weather shifted, gray skies swirling overhead like an omen. At the gates of Storm's End, they were met by grim-faced guards who escorted them inside. The fortress was austere, battered by wind and salt spray from the sea. Robert Baratheon awaited them in the Great Hall, flanked by his bannermen. Some of the lesser storm lords, each looking ready for battle at a moment's notice. Robert himself stood with his arms folded, his face carved from stone. He offered only the barest courtesy to the king. Rhaegar removed his helmet and faced Robert evenly. The tension between them crackled. In a slow, careful voice, Rhaegar explained that he had come to hear Robert's grievances, to see if a peaceful resolution could be found. He acknowledged that the Dornish marches remained a point of conflict, and that the crown should do more to protect border lords from raiders. He even offered to appoint a new warden of the marches, someone not Dornish, to oversee a fair approach. Yet Robert was unmoved. He spoke of how Rhaegar had humiliated him at Harrenhal, of how the Targaryens had burned his grandfather's farmland, of how the realm still trembled under the memory of the Mad King. Rhaegar listened, face impassive, but inside he grieved that hatred could fester so deeply. At last, the king said, "I did not come here to trade insults, Lord Baratheon. I came to prevent bloodshed. Will you lower your sword? Or must we truly break this realm once more for old grudges?" Robert's answer was as direct as a blow from his warhammer. Old grudges. A Targaryen can speak lightly of old grudges because it was never his kin who were burned alive in the madness of your father. You speak of peace, but you stand on the ashes of countless innocents. You speak of justice, But how do we trust a dragon that can burn us whenever it pleases? He stepped closer, towering over Rhaegar. You say you want no war? Fine. Prove your good faith. Bend the knee to the great lords of Westeros and accept that the Targaryen monarchy is no better than any other. Swear that you will not reign over us with an iron fist. Put aside your father's monstrous legacy. Jon Connington snarled at the implied demand for the king to lower himself. Ser Barristan looked on, tense but silent. Ser Arthur Dayne's hand twitched near the hilt of dawn. Rhaegar took a breath. I have already renounced my father's tyranny, he said quietly. I will not kneel, but I will pledge fairness. I will vow that the crown is not above the laws of gods and men. I am King Robert, but I am no tyrant. Is that not enough? Robert's eyes burned. Nothing will be enough until House Targaryen pays for its crimes. That was the moment Rhaegar realized there would be no real peace with Robert Baratheon. The man's fury was personal, not political. The king felt an ache in his chest, remembering how Lyanna Stark had once looked at him with that strange intensity at Harrenhal. He bowed his head. Then you leave me no choice. Robert bared his teeth in a parody of a grin. Then draw your sword, Dragonspawn. Let us see if the warrior king can fight as well as he can pluck a harp. Before the situation could devolve into immediate violence, Jon Connington hissed at Rhaegar to leave. Ser Barristan and Ser Arthur placed themselves between Robert and the king. Robert's bannermen shifted, hands on swords. The hall crackled with the threat of bloodshed. But Rhaegar did not wish to spark an open brawl in the heart of Storm's End. He stepped back, jaw clenched, and signaled for his men to withdraw. Robert let them go, though his laughter followed them out, echoing with mockery. The ride back to King's Landing was grim. Rhaegar said little, his face tight. Jon Connington raged about Robert's insolence, wanting to raise an army at once. Ser Barristan tried to counsel patience, but even he seemed shaken. Ser Arthur Dayne rode silently, though Rhaegar could sense the night of the morning's tension. War was at their doorstep. When the king returned to the Red Keep, he convened the council. News spread rapidly. Robert Baratheon had refused to bow, refused to treat with the king in good faith. Soldiers in the Stormlands were reportedly mobilizing. Ravens from Casterly Rock suggested that Tywin Lannister was considering sending an envoy to Robert, though no official alliance had been made. The realm teetered on the... At that council, Rhaegar set his jaw and decreed that if Robert raised his banner in rebellion, the crown would answer with full might. It was a reluctant decision, but a necessary one. The hope for peace flickered like a dying candle in the wind. The next day, Robert Baratheon formally declared himself in rebellion, claiming that King Rhaegar was unfit to rule, that House Targaryen was a blood-soaked family of tyrants. He called on all lords who had ever suffered under Aerys' reign to join him. The lines were drawn. Across the 7 kingdoms, alliances shifted. House Martell rallied behind the king, as did House Tyrell, though with some caution. They remembered the power of the Stormlands. The north was slow to move, for Lord Ricard was bedridden, and Ned was uncertain. Brandon Stark, however, had visited Robert at Storm's End, and some said Brandon was swayed by his old friend's fiery arguments. House Arryn was torn, for Jon Arryn was loyal to the crown by principle, but Robert was his foster son. The Vale vacillated, uncertain. The Riverlands, under House Tully, hesitated as well, mindful that a war could devastate their lands. Yet Rhaegar had not wasted his months. He had built alliances carefully, forging new friendships and retaining the loyalty of many who had once served his father out of fear. Now they served Rhaegar out of respect and cautious optimism. The majority of the Kingsguard remained loyal. The city watch of King's Landing was better disciplined than before. The crown's finances were still precarious, but the realm was not bankrupt. As the first armies began to muster, King Rhaegar sought out Ned Stark once more, sending a personal letter. He wrote of how he had tried to prevent war, how Robert had spurned every overture. He reminded Ned of his vow that the crown would treat the North fairly. He begged Ned to keep the North neutral if it would not fight for him, and not to join Robert's rebellion. Lord Ricard's health prevented a decisive move. Eddard, reading Rhaegar's heartfelt plea, was torn between loyalty to his friend Robert and the sense that Rhaegar truly was a different king. The letter weighed heavily on him. The war began in skirmishes, with Stormland forces clashing against Crown loyalists near Summerhall and in the Dornish marches. Blood was spilled. Ravens flew. Robert Baratheon personally led some of these raids, his formidable warhammer crushing the skulls of any Targaryen knight who stood against him. The strength and charisma of the Stormlord drew others to his side, though not as many as he might have hoped. The Tyrells soon moved against him from the Reach, pinning him between their might and the Crown's. Yet Robert fought like a man possessed, driving back Tyrell bannermen in a few early victories. He roared that he would kill every last Targaryen, from old Aerys in his tower to the babes in the nursery. Within the Red Keep, Queen Elia clutched her children, fear gnawing at her heart. Aerys, the deposed king, cackled in his private chambers, sometimes screaming about wildfire and traitors. Rhaegar forced himself to ignore his father's ravings, focusing on the tasks at hand. Every moment was a test of his resolve. He wore black armor chased with gold, the three-headed dragon emblazoned across his chest. On the battlefield, he was a force of nature, matching Robert's fury with skill and precision. But the war had just begun. Then came a development that would rattle the realm. House Stark declared its neutrality, refusing to side with Robert. The letter from Ned, delivered to King Rhaegar by Raven, explained that Lord Rhaegar was too ill to fight, and the North would not commit its forces to a war rooted in old grievances and pride. Nor, however, would it fight for the crown. It would remain neutral, guarding its own borders. This was a blow to Robert, who had counted on the North. It was a relief to Rhaegar, who had feared the combined might of the Stormlands and the North. But neutrality was not unwavering support. Rhaegar would have to stand largely on his alliances with the Reach and Dorne. As the war escalated, Rhaegar personally led armies into the Stormlands, seeking to corner Robert. Battles flared. Castles changed hands. The Stormlords, loyal to Robert, fought tenaciously against Tyrell knights who advanced from the west. Rhaegar scored a significant victory at the Battle of Summerhall, capturing several of Robert's key bannermen. But Robert himself slipped away, retreating deeper into the Stormlands. The Crown's forces pressed on, though the storms of the region turned the roads into muddy quagmires. Morale flagged and disease spread in the camps. Back in King's Landing, tensions soared. Aerys' madness spiked dangerously. He demanded to be allowed to lead an army of his own, raving about how only Dragonfire would end the Baratheon threat. Rhaegar refused, which enraged Aerys to the point of violent outbursts. Servants whispered that the old king had begun stockpiling wildfire again, hidden beneath the Red Keep. When Rhaegar heard these rumors, he confronted his father directly. He found Aerys pacing in his chambers, hair wild, eyes bloodshot. The old king railed at his son for betraying him, for stealing the throne. "Father," Rhaegar said calmly, "you abdicated of your own will. You gave me the crown. I must wage this war now. Stand aside." Aerys shook with fury. "I never said you could degrade the Targaryen name with your weakness. You coddle the realm, you listen to lesser men. Fire and blood, that was the Targaryen way. I should never have stepped down. I will not let you squander our birthright." He howled, lunging for his son. Rhaegar stepped back, letting the Kingsguard restrain the old man. Heart heavy, he realized how dire the situation had become. Aerys was a threat, but to do away with him entirely would appear monstrous, patricidal. He ordered the old king confined to his chambers with double the guard, instructing them to ensure Aerys had no access to wildfire. It was a stopgap solution at best. Days turned to weeks. The campaign in the Stormlands raged on, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Robert's skill in battle was nearly unmatched, but Rhaegar had the numbers and the more disciplined army. Casualties piled up on both sides. The small folk fled in droves from the fighting, cursing kings and rebels alike for the devastation. Rhaegar refused to turn the war into a slaughter, insisting his men show mercy whenever possible. Robert, for his part, singled out Targaryen loyalists for brutal punishments. The chasm between them only widened. Finally, a large-scale confrontation loomed near the Trident, reminiscent of how events might have unfolded in another timeline. Robert's forces, pressed from the south, moved northward, hoping to circle around and possibly forge an alliance with House Tully. Rhaegar marched to intercept him, bringing the bulk of the Crown's army. The Tyrells approached from another angle, coordinating with Rhaegar's strategy. The stage was set for a colossal battle, one that could decide the fate of the rebellion. Rain fell in sheets as the two armies arrayed themselves on opposite sides of the wide, swollen river. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rhaegar sat astride a white stallion, his black armor shining wetly. Around him, knights brandished spears and swords. Banners flapped in the wind. Dragons, roses, the spears of Dorne. On the far side, Robert's force displayed the crowned stag of House Baratheon, defiant and unbroken, though they looked weary. In the midst of that watery churn, with lightning streaking overhead, the two sides charged. The clang of steel on steel filled the air. Horses screamed, men shouted battle cries, and the river splashed with every frantic motion. Rhaegar led the charge, Ser Arthur Dayne at his side, carving a path through Baratheon lines. Robert roared from the other side, warhammer raised high, smashing aside knights who dared to oppose him. Blood mingled with rainwater, turning the shallows red. Soon enough, the two champions found each other. Robert swung his hammer at Rhaegar with the force of a raging bull. Rhaegar parried with his sword, though the impact nearly unhorsed him. Lightning illuminated their struggle. Around them, fighting gave way as men recognized the two central figures in this war. Rhaegar slashed, Robert blocked, returning with a savage overhead blow that Rhaegar barely evaded. Again and again, they clashed, the water churning around their mounts. Each blow was hammered steel meeting Valyrian cunning. Rhaegar, determined, found openings with his speed, slicing Robert's arm. The stag snarled in pain, but answered with a blow to Rhaegar's side, denting the armor and sending the king reeling. Still, Rhaegar held firm. Blood trickled into his eyes from a cut on his temple, but he refused to yield. He remembered his father's madness, his vow to be a different kind of king, and the countless lives depending on this moment. Summoning his strength, Rhaegar feinted high, then slashed low, catching Robert's horse in the flank. The beast stumbled, forcing Robert to leap clear. Seizing the moment, Rhaegar urged his mount forward, sword aimed at Robert's chest. But Robert, cunning in the midst of fury, dove to the side and brought his hammer up into the horse's belly. The stallion shrieked, and Rhaegar was thrown. He crashed into the shallows, water rushing around him. Robert rose, hammer in hand, panting, a feral grin on his bruised face. "We end this now," Robert growled, lifting the warhammer high. Rhaegar forced himself upright, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. His sword was still in hand. He lunged, a desperate thrust. Robert tried to pivot, but the sword sliced through his mail, biting deep into his shoulder. Robert roared, staggering. The hammer slipped from his grasp, yet in the last instant, he brought his fist around, smashing it into Rhaegar's face. The king tasted blood. The world spun. Both men collapsed in the shallows, battered and bleeding. Soldiers rushed forward, loyalists from each side. Ser Arthur Dayne waded in, intercepting a Baratheon knight who tried to finish the king. A swirl of combat erupted around them. The last thing Rhaegar saw before darkness threatened to take him was Robert, also unconscious or nearly so, being dragged away by his bannermen. When the tide of battle finally receded, the battered remains of Robert's forces withdrew, carrying their leader to safety. The Crown's army, bloodied but not broken, held the field. Men shouted victory, though it was a grim, joyless triumph. Rhaegar's body was found, still clinging to life, and rushed to a maester's tent. For hours, the maesters worked to save him, extracting fragments of metal from his battered torso, stitching wounds, praying to the Seven. At last, they stabilized him, though it was said the king might never fight again with the same prowess. Robert Baratheon, too, clung to life somewhere in the Riverlands, cursing the Targaryen name as he bled. He had not won, but neither was he destroyed. In the aftermath, many Stormlords deserted, seeing that the crown had nearly felled their champion. Others remained loyal, hoping that Robert would rise again. Word of the battle spread across Westeros like a storm. Some saw it as a sign that the Targaryen king was favored by the gods. Others claimed that if Robert recovered, he would come back stronger than ever. Queen Elia wept with relief that her husband lived, though she feared for the future. Aerys ranted in his chambers about how the entire realm should be burned to cinders. In the weeks that followed, King Rhaegar slowly regained his strength. From his sickbed, he ordered that captured rebels be offered clemency if they would swear loyalty to the crown. Many accepted, weary of war. The impetus behind Robert's rebellion seemed to falter as Robert remained gravely wounded, hidden by his most loyal followers. Rhaegar's triumphant though costly stand at the Trident had turned the tide. One by one, rebellious lords laid down their arms. The war ground to a close, not with a resounding final victory, but with a slow, grinding submission of the rebellion. The Stormlands were ravaged, and Robert Baratheon had vanished, rumored to be in exile across the Narrow Sea or in hiding in the Vale. When King Rhaegar at last rode back into King's Landing, the city erupted with cheers. It was a battered king returning from a bitter struggle, but he had prevailed. A sigh of relief swept the realm. The dream of a renewed peace began to take shape, though it was tinged with the fresh scars of war. Rhaegar's body bore those scars, and his soul felt the weight of the men he had killed. Yet he was determined to rule justly and mercifully, to ensure that the horrors of his father's reign were never repeated. House Lannister, seeing the tides had turned, dispatched envoys to congratulate the king on his victory. House Tyrell boasted of its role in quelling the rebellion. House Martell stood proud, allied in blood with the royal family. The North remained aloof, content that it had avoided the worst of the war. Eddard Stark sent a letter of condolence for the lives lost and an offer of peace. Rhaegar accepted it graciously, hoping to strengthen ties with the wolves of the North in the coming years. Aerys II Targaryen, in the end, died not long after from complications of a fever that seized him during his confinement. Some whispered that it was poison. Others said the old king had simply succumbed to the madness rotting him from within. Rhaegar ordered a discreet funeral, attended only by a few. There was no grand state ceremony. The Mad King was laid to rest among his forebears in the Great September, his legacy one of fear and shadows. With the old king gone, Rhaegar found himself both freed and haunted. No longer did he fear that Aerys might wreak new havoc or undermine his rule. Yet the ghosts of the past lingered in the deserted corridors where Aerys had prowled. Rhaegar comforted Elia and their children, reassuring them that the Targaryen lineage would endure. He prayed that the realm would not soon see another war. In time, the scars of the rebellion began to heal. Rhaegar poured effort into rebuilding the Stormlands, offering incentives for loyal lords to invest in roads, trade, and farmland. He sought to pardon men who had followed Robert out of fear or loyalty, hoping to prevent the seeds of another uprising. He turned his attention to forging unity among the great houses, summoning them to King's Landing for council and feasts, negotiating alliances and marriages. The Lannisters, always hungry for influence, aligned with the crown through marital ties to lesser branches of House Targaryen or House Martell. The Tyrells boasted of their role in the final victory and leveraged it for positions at court. Dorne maintained a place of prominence, thanks to the Queen. The Arryns remained somewhat distant, torn by residual loyalty to Robert, but they did not openly defy the king. Robert Baratheon's fate remained uncertain. Some claimed he was dead, his wounds too severe. Others said he bided his time across the sea, nursing old hatreds. The rumor mill churned with stories of a giant warrior with a crowned stag helm spotted in the free cities. If he ever returned, would Westeros face another storm of rebellion? That question lingered, but the crown's immediate concerns were too pressing to dwell on ghosts. Lyanna Stark, for her part, never married Robert. The betrothal was finally annulled by mutual agreement of houses Stark and Baratheon, though Robert was not there to protest. She remained in Winterfell, a restless spirit, though rumors swirled that she might eventually take a northern lord as husband or even join the Silent Sisters if her grief for Robert was genuine. The truth of her feelings for Rhaegar was never aired publicly. In the privacy of the Godswood, she might have cried for what might have been, or for the illusions of youthful romance that had sparked so much turmoil. In the years that followed, King Rhaegar's reign became the subject of many songs. Some sang of his mercy, others of his martial prowess. Over time, historians would note that the realm stabilized under his rule, despite the threat of rebellion that had nearly engulfed it. The memory of Aerys' Tus madness slowly receded, replaced by the image of a silver-haired king who fought with valor, ruled with reason, and cherished his family. Not all was perfect, no king's reign ever is, but compared to the flames of the past, it was a gentler light. Small folk told each other stories of how the new king had once played the harp so beautifully that even the crickets hushed to listen. Others remembered how he had refused to burn castles and villages, even at the height of the war, preferring to capture rather than destroy. He had proven himself a warrior, but not a butcher. Some called him the Dragon of Summerhall, referencing his victory that turned the tide against Robert. Others, more poetically, called him the Stormbreaker. Rhaegar himself cared little for titles. His greatest wish was to ensure that none of his children would have to face the horrors of a realm torn apart by war. As time wore on, the rebellious lords who had once followed Robert either made their peace or saw their lines fade into obscurity. The Stormlands eventually came under the leadership of Stannis Baratheon, who grudgingly knelt to King Rhaegar when faced with no viable alternative. Stannis was a hard, unyielding man, but he recognized that continuing the fight was futile without Robert's presence. The king, for his part, treated Stannis with cautious respect, granting him certain concessions for the region's rebuilding. Together, they established a tense, workable relationship, neither truly trusting the other, but both bound by necessity. King's Landing began to flourish, as trade reopened fully and peace brought merchants from Essos. Queen Elia oversaw charitable works, founding a hospital funded by the crown to treat the poor. The city watch was reformed under stricter rules, reducing corruption. The king's court became a place where knights and ladies could gather for tournaments, feasts, and celebrations, rather than living in fear of a mad monarch's whims. In that new era, Rhaegar would occasionally wander the halls of the Red Keep at night, haunted by the illusions of what might have been. If his father had never descended into madness, if the realm had never teetered on rebellion, if Harrenhal's events had not entangled him with Lyanna Stark. His face bore lines of sorrow and wisdom both, and sometimes he would clasp his harp, playing a song of yearning or reflection. But in the morning, he rose as king, dealing with each new challenge patiently. Over the course of many years, the realm saw a generation grow up who knew only the reign of King Rhaegar, who saw the Targaryen dragon not as a symbol of terror, but of careful guardianship. Those old enough to remember Aerys' horrors would sometimes murmur, "He's not his father, thank the gods." And indeed, the difference was stark. Where Aerys had ruled by fear, Rhaegar ruled by a tempered mixture of strength and compassion. Where Aerys' unpredictability had driven lords to plot treason, Rhaegar's even-handed policies soothed the land. The threat of war never vanished entirely. There were always pockets of discontent, but no grand rebellion coalesced to threaten the throne anew. If Robert Baratheon lived, he did not return, and thus the specter of his vendetta dwindled into half-forgotten rumor. Years after the war's final skirmishes, a middle-aged King Rhaegar stood on the walls of the Red Keep, gazing out at Blackwater Bay. Ships came and went, carrying goods and travelers to distant shores. The sunlight glittered on the water, and a breeze ruffled his silver-gold hair, which was threaded now with strands of gray. Queen Elia joined him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Their children had grown. Prince Aegon was nearing manhood. Princess Rhaenys blossomed into a poised young woman. A fragile peace had been nurtured through the king's decisions, his resilience, his willingness to let mercy temper wrath. Rhaegar turned to his wife, remembering how close the realm had come to collapsing under the weight of old grudges and his father's sins. Sometimes, Elia, I wonder what this land would look like if I had not taken the throne when I did. She offered a small, wise smile. We cannot know. Perhaps it would have burned. Perhaps it would have turned upon itself until no one remained to hold it together. But you did take the throne, and the realm endures. He pressed a kiss to her brow. Let us hope it endures for many more years. Let us hope our children grow to rule a land that knows more peace than strife. So ended one chapter of the realm's tumultuous history, shaped by the single monumental decision of a broken king named Aerys II Targaryen, who had chosen to abdicate rather than drag the Seven Kingdoms further into the dark. Rhaegar's ascension had not prevented war entirely, but it had changed its course. The rebellion flared and died more quickly, leaving scars but not complete ruin. And though ghosts of the past still whispered in forgotten corners, a new generation now looked upon the Iron Throne with something akin to hope, rather than dread. In that fragile hope, the realm found its future, one in which a dragon prince, crowned too soon, learned what it meant to rule with both fire and grace.